panel, and I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak for up to 5 to 7 minutes each. Lord Black of Brentwood, Guy Black, Executive Director of the Telegraph Media Group, member of the House of Lords, Director of the Press Complaints Commission for 7 years, up till 2003, happily also the Chairman of the Commonwealth Press Union Trust. Martin Moore on that end, Director of the Media Standards Trust, worked as a journalist in many places, BBC and the Mirror Group included, a cogent voice in the public domain calling for a stricter regime, providing real checks on media power, especially, he would say, against the intrusion into people's lives. Ian Beales will be next, a former UK regional newspaper editor, now in the engine room of self-regulation as the Secretary of the Committee on the Editorials Code and author of the official handbook of it. Then we're going to hear from Angela Phillips, a journalist for 30 years. Anybody here not a journalist? Teaches journalism at Goldsmiths University of London. And Sunanda Datta-Ray began his journalistic career, believe it or not, in Stockport in 1958, when London still had proper yellow fog, and the Guardian was called the Manchester Guardian.
The media has been under unprecedented scrutiny in this country now for well over a year. A scrutiny that's come from 3 sources. It's come from a police investigation, which has seen the biggest biggest operation in British criminal history, bigger even than the investigation into the Pan Am murders at Lockerbie. It's involved at its peak up to 171 police officers working on 3 inquiries. They have been conducting dawn raids on journalists' homes, which, if they took place in some Commonwealth countries, we would rightly object to, and by the end of it, that police inquiry would have cost us £40 million. We have been subjected to 6 parliamentary inquiries who have scoured every detail of the way the media operates, none of which has recommended any form of statutory control of the press. And then, of course, we've had the Leveson Inquiry, which has had sweeping powers at its disposal, powers even greater than the Chilcot Inquiry. It's cost almost as much as the Chilcot Inquiry, over 100 days of hearings and 474 witness statements. No industry in modern time has endured such scrutiny. Not the banks, not the medical profession after Shipman, not the pension industry. And I think that has already, the combination of all of that has already had a discernible chilling impact on press freedom. And I regret that actually we haven't, in the combination of all these things, had chance to concentrate on 2 key issues. The first is the thing that is changing the face of the media and will have a far greater long-term impact on the culture, practice and ethics of the press than anything else, and that's the internet. And the second, and that's why tonight is so welcome, is to look at the international ramifications. What happens here around the world. We're blessed in this country with a 3-centuries-old tradition of press freedom. Since the last statutory regulation on the press was abolished in 1695, we get sometimes blasé about it, we may take it for granted, but many people around the world don't have this luxury. Many people have to die for press freedom. And when we look at what's happening in this country, we have to place it in that context. Now, I'm not, having made those opening context, I'm not going to be an apologist for the past. Terrible things have happened on one newspaper. We heard a lot at the Leveson Inquiry of some of the excesses of the media, and nothing that I think any of us would ever do would be to diminish that in any way. So change is coming, but the question is, what kind of change is going to happen in regulation? And after all the ink has been spilled, after all the words have been completed, we will be faced with a simple choice. Do we want state regulation of the press, or do we want self-regulation of the press? And I think I should be absolutely clear at the start. I believe this is a binary choice. There isn't a middle way. If we don't have state regulation rooted in the industry, we have state. If we don't have self-regulation, we have state regulation. You can dress it up how you will, underpinning, recognition, undergirding was a new one I heard the other day, but they are all the same thing. So we have these two propositions. We have a self-regulatory proposition on the table, which the industry is putting forward, which would be for an entirely new system of tough independent regulation for the press. It would be a radical departure from the past. It's not PCC plus, it's not son of PCC, it is a wholly new system which will provide a balance between strong protection for the public and maintaining a free, responsible press. For the first time, the system of regulation will be buttressed by law, not statute law, but contract law, enforceable through the civil courts. It will have powers to deal with breakdowns in standards, including the ability to fine publishers up to £1 million. It will have real investigative powers. It will provide speedy redress for complainants. It will have a structural guarantee of independence from the industry, and it will be durable and future-proof because it will allow digital publishers into the system. And all that is deliverable swiftly without the need for intervention by politicians. So that's the self-regulatory, independent approach. Then we have the statutory approach. Now, on the one hand, as I got into a debate with Lord Justice Leveson and Robert Gray at the Inquiry, there were huge philosophical objections to state involvement in press regulation. The Lord Chief Justice over a year ago talked about the independence of the press being a constitutional necessity. And he's right, because all other freedoms depend on it. But the press cannot be independent if politicians are involved in regulating it, because the press is a watchdog which scrutinises those in power. And we would be in the absurd position where we have parliamentary scrutiny of a body the electorate depends upon to scrutinise Parliament. Now, I don't doubt the commitment of anyone here to democracy and liberty, but rushing to embrace statute in response to events which were above all the results of the failure of law is the wrong way to do it. It is simply playing with fire, and at risk are not just the personal freedoms of the British public, which depend on a free press, but the future of many countries in the world who look to us to set an example. Yes, change is on the way, but let that change be rooted in the constitutional necessity of an independent press.
I'm particularly anxious about one proposed new system, a system that has a good chance of being enacted. The proposed system that I'm talking about is not statutory. No, this system has been put forward by parts of the news industry, most notably by Lord Black and Lord Hunt. And the proposals are, I think, regressive, could damage the future of journalism in this country, and could certainly harm free speech. Why? Because they include, amongst other things, proposals to accredit journalists and give press cards only to those within the system. This would effectively create a closed shop that's anathema to free speech. Proposals to restrict access to press association news feeds, which to me smacks of cartel-like practices and may even be illegal, and proposals to perpetuate the power of a small group of national news organisations that have dominated self-regulation for the past few decades, most notably News International, associated in the Telegraph Group. To adopt such proposals would, I think, be unhealthy, undemocratic, and go entirely against the grain of open journalism in the digital world. So yes, we desperately need a new system, a genuinely new system, a system which ensures that these big media corporations do not wield such unaccountable power, that they are not free to corrupt public life. The law is not a cure for all ills, but neither should it be seen as an inevitable precursor to Mugabe's Zimbabwe. In 2003, Finland passed a law, the Act on the Exercise of Freedom of Expression in the Mass Media. This law gave the public a right of reply to misrepresentation in news articles. It gave news outlets a duty to correct those articles. It obliged news organisations to appoint a responsible editor who would be liable should the publication breach the law. And these laws sit beneath the system of Finnish self-regulation run by the Council for Mass Media. This is, by any other phrase, statutory underpinning for self-regulation. And since it was brought into place in 2003, what terrible effect has this law had on press freedom in Finland? How constraining has it been? Well, last year, Finland was number 1 on the World Press Freedom Index. In the last 10 years, Freedom has been number 1 in 8 of the last 10. Where does the UK sit? Number 28.
Because that is actually what I think Martin is suggesting. He's suggesting that we get rid of what we have. He ignores the fact that we have laws. He minimises the effect of statute as though, to coin one of the hacked off campaigners, it's just a dab of statute, something you put behind each ear to make something more fragrant perhaps. You can't have a mere dab of statute, a speck, a spot, a touch, a smidgen of statute. You just can't be a little bit pregnant or a little bit dead. For there is no magic, whatever Martin may say, in statutory regulation. It's not inherently efficient or effective. That is a grand illusion. And are the systems that regulate the forces of law and order inherently more trustworthy than press self-regulation? The police are statutorily regulated, but I seem to recall that has not avoided the curious statistic that while 400 people have died in police custody, no officer has been found guilty in connection with the death. To claim that statutory backstop is needed to inspire public trust is delusional. The reality is that it achieves nothing that couldn't be delivered by a voluntary system with all the built-in safeguards that Guy has outlined. Overlaying a statutory element on press self-regulation would make it susceptible to constant threat from further state encroachments. It's one thing to live in the last chance saloon, which arguably has been British journalism's spiritual home for the last 3 proud centuries, of delivering freedom of expression, but quite another to move into some coffee lounge of state approbation. It would be turning the clock back on freedom. What a message that would send to the world. Now, of special concern to those here tonight, and Martin has mentioned Zimbabwe, for example, I would ask the question, how would that affect them? It's a rhetorical question, because I've asked that question of 6 media commentators around the Commonwealth. This is what they say. Jethro Goko, CEO of the recently reborn Daily News in Zimbabwe, which had years of repression and was closed, says, many of the publishers and editors on the African content that I've discussed this unimaginable possibility with worry that if the UK does ill-advisedly take this route, it will be like manna from heaven for all the dictatorial regimes of the world. Indeed, I can only imagine the unrestrained joy that some people around President Robert Mugabe would derive from such a backward step in the UK.
If you ask the wrong question, if you put it in the wrong way, you will almost certainly get the wrong answer. I wanted to just in passing reiterate what Martin has said about what we've seen so far of the plan that's come from Lord Black, which does within it tighten up press freedom in a way which is far greater than anything either Martin or media reform are actually suggesting. And what is more terrifying for me is that it does so and gives the entire control of journalism to a group of editors and proprietors from the popular press, because they are the organisations that currently dominate the Press Council. And what we're actually talking about here is the possibility that they may control who is allowed to have access to a wide range of information. We are in a situation where we are able to use computer-assisted research in a way which far outstrips anything we've ever been able to do in the past, and we have not yet worked out how to do it in an ethical way. The right to pry into the lives of ordinary citizens is not what Enlightenment philosophers had in mind when they called for press freedom. Prying without a genuine public interest is ethically unsupportable, and we should not as a society support it. On the other hand, those same Enlightenment philosophers would, I am certain, if they had been alive today, have upheld the right of ordinary people to speak back to the power of the press. Those of us who teach journalism know that our young journalists are going out into an industry where they are not supported to learn and to understand how to be ethical journalists. They are put under pressure to provide the story as fast as possible and by any means necessary. And we need to reverse that. We need to create a media that we can be proud of. And we're doing it in a very, very difficult situation where we know that newspapers are going through the worst financial crisis ever. They will blame Leveson for what happens next, but it won't be Leveson's fault.
A conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, who created Singapore, was that this idea of the freedom of the press being the buttress of democracy is one of the many Western myths with which the colonialists have saddled us. How, he said, before you dismiss that out of hand, how, he said, is the media going to ensure integrity in the government when media institutions themselves are riddled with corruption? And that, he pointed to specific examples with which I won't bore you, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and now he might well include Great Britain. After 54 years in the trade, and I say the trade, not the profession, after 54 years in the trade, one doesn't nurse many illusions about either the malaise or the cure. One also suffers from a sense of déjà vu. Before I started in the Stockport Advertiser, I was at Manchester University, and I looked up one of my old diaries, and I found that on Thursday, the 18th of November, we debated, this House prefers the news of the world, the newspaper, to the news of the world. So this awareness was there then. Let's not, what did Macaulay say about the great British public in one of its periodical fits of morality? Let's not go overboard with righteousness on this issue. I'd agree that self-regulation is the ultimate solution, but self-regulation, as Angela said, stiffened with certain do's and don'ts, with a system of fines and carrots and cane, if you like. The newspaper industry must be transformed from a trade to a profession. It must have proper entry courses, proper training, proper regulations, like doctors, like lawyers. It's now a free-for-all, and as long as it's a free-for-all, it cannot be brought under statutory regulation.
So my question to Ian and to Guy, if they're listening, sorry, that's how I address my students. My question to Ian and Guy is, where is the chilling effect on television and radio journalism in this country, which are governed by statute, by Ofcom, by the BBC Trust? Not suggesting for 1 minute that we should apply the same organisational regulation to the press, but the principle, I'm afraid, from your point of view, just doesn't stand up.
The press is there to criticise governments when they get it wrong. The BBC 10 o'clock news is never going to lambast the Prime Minister or Ed Miliband or whoever it might be because they've made some terrible error about something. It's there to report factually. It's the press which holds the feet of politicians to the fire when they get it wrong, because they're not licensed, they're not there to be impartial, they are there to represent the public. And I've got a quote here actually, which I think deals probably perfectly with your point, from Mark Thompson at the Leveson Inquiry, when he was talking about how broadcasters need the investigative resources of the press to produce stories. He said the BBC would never have paid the information that helped the Daily Telegraph to uncover the MP's expenses scandal. The privately owned Daily Telegraph took a view and was able to publish a series of stories that, taken as a whole, were clearly in the public interest. If ever you need an example of why press regulation should be different from broadcast regulation, that saga of the MP's expenses, which is one of the most serious public interest stories in a generation, I think underlines it.
The most shocking thing was to see the cream of the British press, and I won't be loved for this, get up one after the other and say, it wasn't me, Gov, wasn't me, Gov, wasn't me, Gov.
Distinctions. Any statute is going to have to work on the basis of definitions and distinctions. That's the nature of statutes. Distinctions are not clear. And the other major distinction is, what is journalism? We're talking about the press here. The press is increasingly not what journalism is. If you're going to regulate, if you're going to legislate, then you have to define that. And what we have now, increasingly, is web-based journalism, if you can call it journalism. Can you call it the press? What can you call it? And more to the point, if you can't define it, how on earth can you regulate it?
Our two organisations are looking at different ways of approaching this, quite radically different ways of approaching this. And I think certainly I would say is that the model that we've come up with, we know that is probably in many ways flawed, but it's the beginning of an approach to the problem.
Thank you, David. We expected some passionate interventions on all sides, and we've had them tonight, but we'll go in reverse order and ask you just literally to say a couple of sentences, if you would, keep it tight, because I think the beer and the wine, hopefully, are being opened next door. That means that Angela was the last to speak, so now the first.
Yes, and I think I'll just pick David Seymour up on what he just says and go back to the very beginning of what I said, and that is that regulation is the means by which a civilised society ensures that public goods are provided to the highest possible standard. And the problem that we suffer is if you have no regulation, that what is the good is chased out by the indifferent, the bad, and the sensational. And that is what we're seeing. And I think that it would actually be to the advantage of the commercial press in this country if they could look to each other and say, well, I'm not going to go down that road because I know we are regulated and I know that they will not go down it either. And I think it's the only way to try and keep some kind of control over what we can now do, now that we have access to the tools of the internet. We have to find some way of regulating, ideally ourselves, but we don't seem to be very good at that part.
Well, Angela, you see the possibility of something better, so do you, Ian, but it's not the same thing. Your turn, very briefly, if you would.
I think that the proposals which are on the table are acceptable, or should be acceptable. I think that, to get back to the point that Angela was making, she says that you have to have journalism to the high standard. But the question is, who decides what is the high standard? If that, to get back to my earlier point, was that you only follow a certain line, if it means that you're not allowed to do anything that sells newspapers, the expression which sort of fell from Angela's lips as though it was the ultimate sin. The job of a newspaper is to stay in business so that it can do its job. It must sell newspapers, it must make money, but it should not do that by exploiting other people, and when it does, there should be remedies. Those remedies are on the table. We do not need statutory regulation to get there, and that would be a great mistake.
Martin Moore, please.
I don't think anyone, certainly no one on this panel, and I don't think anyone in this room wants to constrain the freedom to report in the public interest. I certainly don't, and indeed have been campaigning for stronger public interest defences in laws, particularly those that don't currently have them. There's been little said tonight about the people who have been, often in very tragic circumstances, monstered by the press and have very, very few places to go, or have had in the past. I just wanted to sort of end on a point about this sort of bogeyman about legislation per se. I mean, people talk about legislation as though it is well, in the words of Lord Black, a dichotomous situation. I mean, I think it's worth saying that those who are opposing the press ban, including some of the key people who are opposing it, have themselves talked about the importance of some sort of legislation, both to protect the press and to protect the public. To quote from Paul Dacre's submission, the editor-in-chief of the Mail, there can be little doubt that if membership of the self-regulatory body gave access to swift and cheap resolution of defamation and privacy cases, this would be a major boon for both the industry and the public. It would also be a huge incentive for cost-conscious publishers to sign up for the new system. Although it would be dependent on Parliament changing libel legislation, it deserves the fullest support. So I think that simply to blanket any sort of use of legislation as bad is both contradictory and bizarre, given that everyone has talked about some use of legislation.
Guy, you outlined the buttressed system that you foresee. It could, you think it could resolve these problems, still a free press, but more responsible. Will Lord Justice Leveson take that route? Chance your arm?
I think I've got 2 points before answering
Please.
answering that question. And I think it's important, Angela was talking to us now about no regulation versus regulation. That's not an offer. There's no question of there being no regulation. What we're talking about is a self-regulatory route which will deliver possibly the toughest system of newspaper regulation anywhere in the world, a world-class system of regulation, or state control of the press. It is that simple. And the 2 points I want to just pick up. The gentleman there from the BBC actually, forgive me, you put your finger absolutely on the most vital thing here. Statute needs to be clear-cut, otherwise it doesn't work. Otherwise it causes all sorts of unforeseen consequences. How can you have a clear-cut statute in this modern digital world? Martin talks about newspapers causing the problems and the scale of size and so forth. The Independent, I take it, you would assume would be a newspaper of the sort which could do damage to an individual. It's got 50,000 readers. Why wouldn't a blog with 100,000 readers then fall to be placed within the bounds of the statute? And once you've got bloggers within a statutory system of supervision, then all freedom of expression in this country is gone.
I think you're going to have to agree to disagree. We've heard all the arguments, and will Lord Leveson buy it, what's being proposed from Lord Hunter himself?
I hope so.
Well, we shall have to wait till the next episode.